Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. By popular demand, we're back with another history-themed episode. Today, we'll be discussing the history of mercenaries and warfare from their origins to modern times. I'm joined by Sean McFate, an expert in foreign policy and national security, and someone with first-hand military experience both in the Army and as a private contractor. Hello, Sean. It's good to be on the show.
It's good to be back.
Great. So can you start by giving us some background on your military service and how you became a modern-day mercenary yourself?
Sure. So I started out as a paratrooper in the U.S. Army's famed 82nd Airborne Division. I served in uniform for about 8 years, and then I, some would say, hopped to the dark side of the fence and became a private military contractor, but not in Iraq and Afghanistan. I worked mostly in Africa, a little bit in Eastern Europe, and did that for several years, and then, came out of that experience scratching my head about a few things, and that's sort of my short version of my background.
Sure. So when and where in history were mercenaries first employed, and how did the idea come about to pay soldiers whose loyalty can fluctuate based primarily on financial concerns?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, people say that mercenaries are the second oldest profession. The Bible mentions mercenaries all the time and never with any sort of retribution. The Romans used mercenaries often. In the Middle Ages, that's how wars were fought. And they used to call them condottieri, which means contractor in Old Italian, and they formed these private military corporations, just like we're seeing today with Blackwater, et cetera. So, and actually the word mercenary comes from merce, which is sort of like the gold you'd pay a soldier, just like solde is the coin you'd pay a soldier too. So the actual roots of the word soldier and mercenary are the same. In fact, most of military history is private military history, and the last 400 years have been the exception and not the rule of just national armies.
Mm-hmm. So the 10,000 were a famous group of Greek mercenaries who fought in a Persian civil war. What did they have to gain by involving themselves in a civil war with their greatest enemies?
Well, that's a great question, too. So Xenophon led the 10,000, when it's funny to think about this, when Alexander the Great, for example, went to war against Persia, he hired Persian mercenaries as well, and the Persians hired Greek mercenaries. And I think people, the armed sort of like soldiers of fortune have always been considered an honorable but bloody trade. And it's only in modern times that we ascribe any sort of a stigma to it.
So Carthage was one of the main powers that relied primarily on mercenaries in the ancient world. What do you think? Do you think that was part of their undoing when competing against professional Roman legions?
That's a good question, too. So, Hannibal and Hamilcar in the Second Punic War, Carthage relied heavily on mercenaries. And it makes sense because they were a very rich country with people, or city rather, with people who didn't really want to fight. They didn't want to have skin in the game. They didn't want to bleed. So they hired mercenaries. Unlike Rome, which was interesting because it was a small, scrappy republic where military service was part of their identity. Hannibal was really a general, marching around the Alps with a mercenary army, defeating Romans at Cannae and other places. Was it their undoing? I don't know. Was it Hannibal's undoing? He did pretty well, except he got tricked at the end. I think one of the questions that we don't ask ourselves is, when you privatize warfare, does it change war? And are there unique strategies to deal with mercenaries that we don't think about today, but they're like market strategies, like Adam Smith needs CrossFit. And the Romans didn't really do that stuff. But the Middle Ages, they did do that stuff.
Mm-hmm. So continuing with the Roman theme, obviously in the late Western Roman Empire, mercenaries proved to be one of the bigger problems for them as a state. Are there any examples of relying heavily on mercenaries that did not lead to or significantly contribute to the demise of a particular state that you can think of?
Well, again, mercenaries were a thematic part of history. We have this modern idea, almost a construction of rewriting amount of history, right? When actually they're pretty mainstream. I mean, the fall of Rome leads to most sort of things, from inflation to barbarians to you name it. Some would say Christianity. But certainly one of the problems that has always haunted mercenaries and using mercenaries is their loyalty, right? The loyalty issue, whether it's ancient Rome, which had issues with this, but it's not just with mercenaries. They also had rebellious armies going back to, Marcus, and 106 BC, he takes a Roman army and marches on Rome. So it's not unique. Treachery is not unique to mercenaries, although what is special to mercenaries and horrible is they go into business for themselves. They can do things like sell out their client to the enemy, or they could, be susceptible to bribes. And these are the issues, for example, that Machiavelli pointed to so clearly in The Prince.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. We'll get to that time period in a minute. But later on in the Byzantine Empire, the Catalan Grand Company was brought into their service. This did not end up panning out very well. What do you think the fatal flaw of that particular venture was?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, the Byzantine Empire also had, the Varangian Guard, which actually was an interesting institution. That was like a bodyguard of Norse mercenaries around the Byzantine Emperor. And they were loyal to the institution of the emperor rather than to a single man, sort of like the Secret Service today. So you have both good examples and bad examples. And, it's hard to say that, being a mercenary by itself causes bad behavior, because there's also a lot of examples of soldiers or professional soldiers or the Janissaries, for example, who engaged in bad behavior too. But I do think that one of the problems that has thematically haunted, again, mercenaries is loyalty, because their interests are not always aligned with the political interests of their employer. And this creates problems. They don't fight for king and country, they fight for coin predominantly.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And I think an important distinction, too, you mentioned the Janissaries. They obviously were essentially little more than slaves, since they were brainwashed from being children. So, that's
a good point.
Yeah. So moving on to the 14th century in Italy, one of the most famous groups was the White Company, or the English Company. They did a fantastic job playing the different warring Italian city-states together and auctioning off their services to the highest bidder. Why were they so willing to pay through the roof for an army that could turn on any of them by being motivated by nothing but pure greed?
That's a great question. So I am right now in Florence, digging through Florence's archives, looking at this very question. And Sir John Hawkwood, who was one of the leaders of the Great White Company, is an interesting case study. He was one of the most celebrated condottieri, or mercenary captains of this era. He was also largely monogamous to Florence. Initially, he wasn't. He was actually fighting against Florence, and Florence bribed his loyalty. And they kept on paying him too. It's not just like he, got the "I'm a Florentine" bug. He was well compensated for his loyalty as well. But the 10,000 was fierce because they were large. They were largely organized. And back then, in the 14th and 15th century, northern Italy back then was like Afghanistan today. It's hard to think of Tuscany as Afghanistan, but it was. It was all these city-states, Milan, Venice, Verona, Florence, Rome, and the papacy. They were always fighting each other, and always, they were very Machiavellian towards each other, to be quite blunt about it. But none of them could afford a standing army. Standing armies are really expensive. So the way that they waged war is that if you were rich enough, you would rent an army. And it wasn't just the city-state. It was the Pope. It was aristocratic families. It was rich people in general could do it. And this created a market for force, like a free market for force, where nobody had a standing army. Everybody, if you wanted to go to war, would have to rent an army. And suddenly war meets the marketplace. You have the strategies of Clausewitz meets the economic logic of Adam Smith. And we don't study this today because we're starting to see more mercenaries, which we'll probably come to at the end of the show. But that changes when you privatize it, because suddenly, strategies of Wall Street matter. So when, for example, when Florence was going to invade Pisa, a smaller city-state in 1506, one of the things that Pisa did in its defense is it secretly bribed half of Florence's mercenaries to defect on battle day. These are market strategies that work in war. There's other things you can do too. If you know you're going to invade another country or Pisa, you might start by buying every mercenary outfit in the region, so that when you do invade, Pisa has no defense. They can't buy any mercenaries because the market has been monopolized by you. Mm-hmm. So that's why you see this strange wars, like the War of Eight States of the 1480s, for example, 1470s. There's all these sort of strange surprises in warfare, and this is what Machiavelli rants about.
Mm-hmm. I find it strange that all these different city-states and countries at the time would rather pay mercenaries and raise their own troops. You'd think it would be cheaper and they'd have their loyalty to rely on.
Well, this is what Machiavelli tried to do. So, and it's actually a really good point. So we, in modern times, think that, of course, it's cheaper, but standing armies are really, really expensive. Renting armies, it's like renting a car. It's generally cheaper to rent than to own. And to pay an army year-round to sit on basically in a barracks and do nothing when they could be out in the field, raising wheat. That's always been ruinously expensive. So, what Machiavelli did is we need to have a militia. He was Florentine, so we need to we'll create a Florence militia, because these are Florentines who will not defect on us because they are defending their homeland, right? Which makes sense, right?
Sure.
But this is what got Florence crushed, Machiavelli. So he created so back in the day of 1500, 1550, he was the equivalent of the assistant secretary of defense or something like that in Florence. And he has this experiment, we're gonna have a militia, we're not gonna depend on violent mercenaries because they're faithless. But when they actually had to go against professional mercenaries, in 1512, they went to a war involving Spanish professional troops. The militia got completely crushed because farmers are no match for professional soldiers. Mm-hmm. It's like our flag football team going against an NFL team. It's going to get crushed. And actually, it's because they got crushed in part that Florence fell to foreign power, and Machiavelli was exiled, and he wrote The Prince in Exile as a way to get his job back, which is ridiculous, because I'm sure the people who just defeated him probably took the manuscript and threw it in the fire. But it's funny that we always assume that militia are superior because of the loyalty. They may be superior by the loyalty, but they're not superior by skills. And that's something that that countries in the 18th, well, most in the 19th century overcame.
So good comparison. So before we get to our next point, I'm curious. I've heard that The Prince was actually written possibly as a parody or him not being completely serious. What's your take on that viewpoint?
I think it is serious. I've heard that viewpoint, and in which case he's got quite a wily sense of humor. But Machiavelli was, to be honest with you, he was known in his time, but he was thought as the epitome of idiocy by, say, the French and the Spanish. We lionize him mostly due to scholarship in the 20th century, but through most of history, especially the history of his time, the 15th and 16th century, he wasn't considered particularly wonderful. He was considered to be obscure or considered to be kind of vile and immoral, but his resurgence came in the last 100 or so years by modern scholars.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So the Swiss Guard is obviously a pretty unique group of mercenaries in history. How did they become in that position? How did they come to that position where essentially they became a mercenary military force that's motivated primarily by religious faith rather than making some sort of deal with another power to provide troops or simply for basic profit.
Yeah, I love the Swiss Guard. So we think of Switzerland today as cuckoo clocks and like chocolate, right?
Yeah.
And illegal money. Switzerland was once a feared nation. It was like, oh my God, the Swiss, And the same could be said of the Swedes, by the way. They weren't just always into IKEA. They were once a fearsome superpower. But the Swiss, during like the 1500s or so, they had the number one mercenaries of any in a world of Europe where it was dominated by mercenary warfare. They were the top, and they had these the cantons formed mercenary outfits that were largely split between pastoral Swiss and urban Swiss, and they had what they called a push a pike. They had these like tight formations with these 15 or 20 foot long pikes that were very heavy. And they were fearsome until it all ended for them. But I think the origins of the Swiss Guard come back to the glory days of Swiss mercenaries and their loyalty towards the Catholic faith. Now the Swiss Guard in the Vatican is actually supplied by Swiss military personnel who dress in pikes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely changed since then. So, of course, one of the examples of mercenaries that Americans would be most familiar with were the famous Hessians of the Revolutionary War. What made the British rely on German soldiers for a quarter of their forces in the entire war, and do you think that was a poor decision at the time?
It wasn't, a lot of things could be said a poor decision, like King George III, but look, I mean, so the mercenary trade didn't go lights out overnight. It gradually went dark. It started to go dark after the 30-Year War, which ended in 1648, and the Treaty of Westphalia. And there was sort of this implicit understanding that mercenaries are very destructive and they do more harm than good. And over the period between, say, 1648 and 1850, which is when they really kind of disappeared.
And I think we might have lost Sean there for a minute. Let's try to get him back on the line. Oh, there he is. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes. You were saying?
Okay. Saying that mercenaries weren't outlawed immediately. They were outlawed. Eventually, they were outlawed by the 1850s. But before that, what happened is that states outlawed non-state actors from hiring mercenaries, but they allowed each other to hire mercenaries. And sometimes when they needed to surge, like what the U.S. did in Iraq, they would rent regiments from other countries. So George III, facing insurgency in the Americas, went to Germany, which had a lot of rental regiments, and said, I just need to double the size of my military, and here's money for you. And those Germans came over, many of which were Hessians, but there were non-Hessians as well, came over and they basically doubled the size of the British Army for their counterinsurgency campaign. It didn't work out very well. Among one reason is that those mercenaries were conscripts who didn't want to be there, and so some of them even defected and stayed in the colonies. Mm-hmm. But they weren't that effective, actually.
Sure. No, and I guess those are actual British troops. In Washington across the Delaware, maybe they wouldn't be sleeping. So that was
right.
Yeah, sure. Now, moving ahead to World War II, the Flying Tigers were some of the pilots of the war, but they were also paid a very high premium for their services. It seems odd to me that they'd let U.S. military personnel go to essentially serve in a mercenary role, even if it was for the purpose of defending China from the Japanese. What's your take on them and their legacy?
So, when we talk today about what Putin is doing in Ukraine, he has little green men, which are basically Russian soldiers working, occupying parts of the Crimea and eastern Ukraine illegally. They're like soldiers without insignia, and they're called little green men. And that's what the Flying Tigers kind of were. They're like little blue men. FDR he wanted to get in the war against Japan and Germany, but Congress didn't want to do that at that time. So he found ways to support military operations by taking Air Force pilots out of uniform, creating this you could argue a mercenary, armed forces, Air Force to support, China against Japan. It wasn't just Americans It was also some other, I think there was Australians and some others as well. But as soon as war was declared, most of those pilots put their American uniforms back on and flew for the U.S. Armed Forces.
Sure. Well, before we go into modern times, I want to ask if there's any examples from history we might not have mentioned that you think are important in the history of mercenaries to talk about.
Oh, there's so many. I don't know. I mean, mercenaries are useful for a lot of. The reason why people like mercenaries is one is they're generally cost effective, at least in the short term. They can be cost ineffective in the long term, but they're also their loyalty is whoever pays them. So, for example, in the 1100s in England, King Henry II was facing this huge rebellion by his nobles in England. And what he ended up doing, rather than trying to play politics with his nobles and try to set some against the others, like the War of the Roses that happened later on, he just hired a whole bunch of mercenaries to go wipe them out, which is what he did, because the mercenaries are loyal to the paymaster as long as you can pay them. Mm-hmm. But one of the biggest problems, of course, is what happens when you can't pay. And this is where mercenary warfare really takes a dangerous edge, because you can't go to court to sue. And mercenaries and their masters continually, throughout history, cheat each other. And this creates all sorts of problems.
How do private military contractors in today's world compare and contrast to the various mercenary groups that have existed in the past?
That's a good question. They differ in some fundamental ways. So if you look at groups like Blackwater and others, they are more what I would call military enterprisers. They support a large national army. They're not sort of standalone military units that can turnkey go to war the way mercenaries used to. However, that's changing right now. And first of all, if you have the skills to be one, you can be another. So if you could go Blackwater, you could probably become a full-on mercenary. So I really don't distinguish two very. It's a blurry line. It's the bottom line. And we're seeing this right now, is that all the private military companies that were used in Iraq and Afghanistan as U.S. contracts have ended, some of those personnel are going out to the world to become full-on mercenaries.
So where would you draw the line in that distinction between being a military contractor and a mercenary, if there's a significant difference?
Well, I think the key difference is if you are a trigger puller, you're a mercenary. Or if you're training others to be trigger pullers, you're mercenaries, because it's the same moral universe. Training and trigger pulling are the same thing. You can't hire somebody who doesn't know how to be an infantry person to teach infantry. So to me, it's the same moral universe. And, academics, and I've argued in my book, there are some nuances, but really when it comes right down to it, I think most people would say Blackwater's a mercenary outfit. If you had to choose between say soldiers or the mercenaries, they come down to the mercenary side of the scale.
Sure. So what areas of the world are mercenaries most used today, and do you think it's more of a positive or negative influence, or something of a mixed bag overall?
Well, I think it's a negative influence. I'll tell you why in a second. But where you're seeing them right now, so during the Iraq and Afghanistan war, that was not a free market for force. That was what we call a monopoly. That means there was one super client, which was the United States, and it had all these sort of mercenary or private military, vendors or suppliers. Now that the U.S. is out of the game for the moment, or not a major player, it's gone global. And it is truly a globalized industry. And so where you're seeing it are, when you have a couple of different types. You have rich countries like Abu Dhabi who want to fight in a war like in Yemen, but they have citizens who don't want to bleed. So they hire mercenaries from, say, Latin America who are ex-special forces to go to Yemen to kill Houthis. Or you're like a country like Nigeria who wants to rent special forces teams and attack helicopters because they don't really have enough of that. And so Nigeria in 2015 hired mercenaries secretly to go and kill Boko Haram, which they did. Or you use them because they give you good plausible deniability. So in the Ukraine war, Russia, Putin uses mercenaries both in Syria and in Ukraine, because you don't really know who they're working for. They're like more black ops than like Spetsnaz black ops, because if you capture them, you don't really know who they work for. And Ukrainians use mercenaries too for that reason. So basically, you see them where you want plausible deniability, or you have a citizenship that is rich but doesn't want to bleed, or you just need some specialized skills, or you need like augmentation, or you're like an oil company that needs muscle. So the reason why they're bad is because mercenaries are incentivized for profit to start and to elongate conflict. And so a world awash in mercenaries is a world with more war. And we have plenty of historical evidence for that.
So would you call your work in Africa and Eastern Europe more of a contractor, or would you identify more as a mercenary in that position?
Well, so there's all sorts of euphemisms and names for what these folks do. Some say they're a private security company or contractors. Some say they're private military contractors. Some say they're mercenary. Some say they're just contingency contractors. At the end of the day, if you're a private, if you're doing military things in the private sector, you're a mercenary. But I don't think that term needs to be as stigmatized as we currently think about it, because most of history, it was not stigmatized. It was considered an honorable profession. So part of what I want to do is not try to make mercenaries honorable, but try to take some of the disdain, some of the venom out of it, because if you look at the historical track record of warfare, a lot of it is privatized. Again, like the Bible mentions mercenaries all the time, but doesn't say they're evil and nasty. It just says that, King so-and-so hired so-and-so swords, So I'm trying to sort of correct the historical record.
Sure, that makes sense. From your personal experience, do you have a particularly harrowing story you can share with us?
Well, I do, not all of which I can share. I mean, one of the things I did, which I'm very proud of actually, is, mercenaries can do some great things too. I worked to help rebuild Liberia's military after Charles Taylor, who's a vile warlord, left in 2003. And Liberia suffered 14 years of civil war. It was horrible. Another thing I did, which I'm very proud of, is I helped some others stop a potential genocide in Burundi. So your listeners might remember in 1994, the Rwandan genocide, Hutu versus Tutsi. In like 90 days, 800,000 people were slaughtered by machetes and other horrible ways to die. And it swept through central Africa. It wasn't just Rwanda, it was Burundi and parts of the Congo and other countries. 10 years after that, in 2004, U.S. intelligence had good intelligence that there would be another assassination attempt on the president of Burundi, and that this could rekindle the genocide. And so our mission was to go in there and secretly prevent this from happening, which we did. And I can't get into the details of how we did it, but it did involve some harrowing moments, and it did involve some fighting between some of the forces on the ground to keep the president alive. And the good news is that we were able to keep him alive. He stood for election. He got unelected, but there was a peaceful transition of power in Burundi. Burundi, however, still is a troubled country, or a troubled region. It's a hot spot, and it's by no means is the problem there over.
Oh, wow. So looking into the future, where do you see the utilization of privatized warfare heading?
Well, I think we're going to see it grow, because nothing can stop it. International law doesn't exist really to stop it, and even if it did exist, who's going to go into Syria and arrest all the mercenaries? Also they can shoot and kill your law enforcement. I see mercenaries growing. It's a trend that has been growing every year. It's just not covered in the New York Times, et cetera. But this might become one of the major security vulnerabilities in the century going forward. Because if you have an industry invested in conflict, going to the most conflict-prone places in the world, you're going to see more war. And again, the people that are going to be using them are going to be rich people who don't have muscle and want it, whether like oil companies, maybe ExxonMobil will have its own army someday, or it's going to be like people who want plausible deniability, like Putin, or it's going to be rich countries like the Emirates who want to have a large force, but they don't want to bleed, or it's going to be people like countries like Nigeria who want specialized skill sets and they just want to rent rather than own an attack helicopter squadron. And there might be others too. It could be like random billionaires who want to do bad things or want to do good things. They might want to end a genocide with mercenary force. But the problem with war, as your listeners know, is that it's the unintended consequences that always get things so horribly wrong. And if you stick more mercenaries into a place like Syria, you don't know what direction the war will take, especially since mercenaries really are loyal to their own stratagems rather than to the paymaster of the moment.
No, that can make it complicated. I'm curious, too, a movie that I always liked was Lord of War. How realistic is something like that, and how big of a role do arms dealers play in kind of escalating this whole situation?
Well, Lord of War was based on Ukrainian Victor Boot and some others, as well as Liberia, Charles and Chucky Taylor. So I have some experience with both, actually. And I did some arms transfers, I guess we call them, from Eastern Europe into West Africa. And it is actually a pretty realistic movie. And arms, I don't think it's the 1990s saw a complete boom of arms dealers, of illegal arms dealers, because of a couple of things. The Soviet Union collapsed, people were selling off arsenals, there's all these wars. I think international community has really caught up a lot with tamping down a lot of those renegade arms dealers. So I don't think you're going to see Victor Boots and other arms dealers like him around. But arms dealing for sure exacerbates problems, and I think what you can see is when mercenaries become arms dealers too. And so one of the things that mercenaries can do very well is they can offer training and equipping. And we even see like mercenaries who work for jihadist terrorists. They're like Sunni mercenaries out of Uzbekistan, and they offer two services. They offer like direct action, which will go and commit terrorist acts, or we can also just professionalize your current militia and bring them up to the next level. And the way you do that is you train and equip. And so there's a convergence there of arms dealers and mercenaries.
Sure. Now, before we get to our last question, if you had to take one hot spot to look at that you think this is going to be the biggest problem moving forward, is there one area you would put the most emphasis on?
Well, the thing that worries me is that warfare in general is going underground in the 21st century, and it's what I call shadow wars. And the reason why is because we live in an information age where plausible deniability can be more powerful than firepower. Putin, for example, could have blitzkrieged into eastern Ukraine with the tank divisions he has and taken it, but he chose things like proxy militia, mercenaries, special forces, little green men, things that offer good plausible deniability. I think that's the future of a lot of warfare, and I think that's where mercenaries are going to play the biggest role and create the most havoc, especially if they play sides against each other. So I would look at shadow wars by big powers. I would also look at rich countries or rich people who don't want to bleed but want to wage war, whether they be multinational corporations or they want to be in the Emirates. And of course, conflict markets, Africa, the Middle East, parts of South Asia, we're going to see them there.
Real quick with Russia, it's obvious everyone knows that it's their troops in Crimea. I find it weird they try to, have plausible deniability or cover that up in some way when, it's pretty obvious. So I don't even see what they have to gain by doing that.
Well, they don't have to gain anything now, but they did at the time. So when they took Crimea over in 2014, what they did is they stationed Spetsnaz there, and while the world was still debating, are they Spetsnaz or not, are they little green men or not, they were sort of occupying. So by the time they sort of raised the Russian flag, it was a fait accompli. And now they own Crimea. It's a flat-out land grab. And plausible deniability was pretty instrumental in them doing that. They were bamboozling the news cycle as they were amassing their forces. So it's not that it doesn't matter now. We all know that they sort of the proverbial cat is out of the bag. But the operation itself, plausible deniability played a pretty key role. Now, whether that happens again, if they do this again, that's a good question.
Yeah. Now, is there any projects you have that you can tell us about? I know you have a few books that you have published as well.
Yeah. So first of all, I started writing a nonfiction book about the world of mercenaries called The Modern Mercenary, but I turned to fiction as a way to really pull back the curtain on this world, the way that John le Carre did for the Cold War, or Tom Clancy did as well in some ways. And I have this, my most recent novel is called Deep Black, and it takes you inside the mercenary world by following the main character, Tom Locke, who's like this kind of a reluctant mercenary, if you will, and it kind of, it's a thinly veiled reality. And I'm also working on a new book coming out early next year called The 10 New Rules of War. And it's a nonfiction book about what will win future wars. And it's kind of, I expect it will be controversial because it's not going to be F-35s and aircraft carriers. It'll be other things entirely.
No, well, we'll keep an eye out for that. It definitely sounds interesting. Thanks so much again for being on the show and telling us all about Mercenaries. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Great. That has been Sean McFate. Fantastic talking to him. And that's our show for today. So we'll be back soon with a new episode, a new topic, and hope you enjoyed this one and you enjoy the next one. Once again, if you're not signed up yet for the mailing list, you can do that at tinyurl.com/The Ajay Bruno Show. You won't get too many messages, just a few emails a month letting you know about what's going on here on this show. So that's it for now, and I'm signing off. Thanks again.